Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and fear. Marianne stood at the crest of a hill overlooking the battlefield. The once vibrant kingdom she had grown up in was now nothing more than a smoldering wasteland. The war had ravaged the land, leaving behind burnt-out villages and fields reduced to ash. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the hilt of the sword strapped to her side, its weight both a comfort and a curse. This was not the life she had envisioned when she first joined the rebellion. Back then she had been young, fierce, and driven by a singular purpose to overthrow the cruel tyrant who had ruled over her people for far too long. Her parents' deaths had ignited a fire in her, one that burned hotter with each injustice she witnessed. But the rebellion had taken its toll. The losses, the betrayals, the blood spilled, it had all led to this moment. The Sanguis Arcanum, the cursed sword that now hung from her belt, pulsed with a dark energy. She had found it during a raid on an ancient temple hidden away in the mountain. The legends surrounding the sword had been whispered in hushed tones for centuries, stories of its power to control blood, its ability to turn the tide of any battle. Marianne hadn't believed the stories at first, but when she had unsheathed the blade, she felt its power surge through her, amplifying her strength, her anger, her resolve. With the sword in hand, victory had come swiftly. The king's forces had fallen one by one, unable to withstand the might of the rebellion. The capital had been taken in a single night, and Marianne had stood victorious over the body of the king, her sword dripping with his blood. She had thought that would be the end of it, that once the tyrant was dead, peace would return to the kingdom. But peace was elusive, and the sword's hunger for power had only just begun. As she surveyed the battlefield, Marianne's thoughts drifted to the promises she had made. She had sworn to her comrades, to the people, that she would restore freedom and justice. But now, standing at the precipice of a new reign, she found herself questioning those ideals. Power had a way of twisting even the noblest of intentions, and the Sanguis Arcanum whispered constantly in her mind, urging her to take more, to control more. "Commander," a voice called from behind her, snapping her out of her thought. She turned to see one of her most trusted lieutenants, a man named Caden, approaching. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, his armor dented from the day's fighting. "The remaining loyalists have surrendered. The city is ours." Marianne nodded, though the victory felt hollow. The people had fought for freedom, for a chance at a better life, and yet as she gazed down at the defeated, she couldn't help but wonder if she had simply replaced one tyrant with another. "Good," she said, her voice cold and detached. "Ensure the city is secured. No one leaves without my permission." Caden hesitated, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "And the prisoners?" "Execute them," Marianne replied without a second thought. "We can't risk another uprising." His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly nodded. "As you command." As he turned to leave, a part of her wanted to call him back to rest in the order, but the sword hummed at her side, feeding her with a sense of absolute control. She gripped the hilt tighter, feeling its power surge through her once more. The blood of the fallen loyalists would ensure her rule, just as it had ensured her victory. Marianne descended the hill, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the choices she had made. The streets of the capital were eerily quiet as she entered, the once bustling city now reduced to a desolate ruin. The people watched her with a mixture of fear and awe, their eyes lingering on the sword at her side. They whispered her name as she passed, but it wasn't the name of a hero they spoke. It was the name of a conqueror, a ruler. She had fought for them, she'd bled for them, and yet now that she stood at the pinnacle of power, they feared her. The sword's influence was growing, its whispers louder, more insistent. It had taken everything from her, and yet she couldn't let it go. It was a part of her now, entwined with her very being. The council chambers were dark, lit only by the dim glow of torches mounted on the stone wall. Marianne sat at the head of the long wooden table, her lieutenants seated around her. They had been with her from the beginning, each one a vital part of the rebellion's success. But now, as they looked at her, she saw doubt in their eyes. "We've done it," Caden said, breaking the silence. "The king is dead, and the capital is ours." But the people, they were scared, Marianne. They were scared of what comes next. "They should be," she replied, her voice sharp. "The king may be dead, but his supporters still lurk in the shadows. We need to be vigilant." They were scared of you. Another voice interjected. It was Lana, one of her oldest friends and the rebellion's most skilled strategist. They see what you've become, you re-ruling through fear, not through the ideals we fought for. Marianne's eyes narrowed. Fear is the only thing that keeps people in line, Laura. Without it, they'll turn on us, just like they turn on the king. That's not what we fought for. Laura shot back, her tone defiant. We fought for freedom, for justice. You were becoming the very thing we sought to destroy. The room fell silent as Marianne's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of the sword. She felt its power coursing through her dark pulse that echoed her anger. Lyria was wrong. She had to be. Marianne had done what was necessary to win, to secure the rebellion. Success. But doubt gnawed at her, just as the sword god gnawed at her soul. Leave us, Marianne said, her voice low and dangerous. The lieutenants exchanged uneasy glances, but they obeyed, filing out of the room one by one until only Lyra remained. You've changed, Lyra said softly, her voice full of sorrow. I barely recognize you anymore. Marianne rose from her seat, her hands still gripping the sword. I did what I had to do. You did me have to use the sword, Lyra countered. You did T have to let it consume you. It's not consuming me, Marianne snapped, so even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. It says giving me the power I need to protect this kingdom. At what cost, Lyra asked, her eyes filled with pain. You were becoming a tyrant, Marianne. You were no better than the king we overthrew. Marianne's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of anger and fear swirling inside her. The sword Estad whispers were louder now, telling her to strike, to silence Ladora's accusations once and for all. But a small part of her, the part that still remembered who she used to be, held back. Leave, Marianne said through gritted teeth, before I change my mind. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Marianne stood there alone with the sword, its power thrumming in her veins. She had done what was necessary. She had no choice. But as she stared at the empty room, the weight of the sword in her hand felt heavier than ever. Marianne paced the cold stone floor of the council chambers long after Lyra had left. Her mind raced, clouded by the weight of her decisions, and the dark whispering of the sword at her side. The Sanguis Arcanum was alive with power, pulsing in sync with the blood in her veins. The sword, once a tool for liberation, was now demanding more from her, more control, more blood, more sacrifice. The door creaked open, and Caden entered, his expression wary. Commander, the people are starting to gather outside the palace. They were asking for an audience. They want to know your plans now that the king is dead. Plans Marianne hadn't thought about what came next. The rebellion had consumed every waking moment of her life for so long that victory felt foreign, uncertain. The sword, as hunger filled the gaps in her mind where doubt tried to creep in. It whispered promises of power and order, of ruling with an iron fist and keeping the chaos at bay. I'll speak to them, she said, the words leaving her mouth before she could fully consider them. Caden looked as though he wanted to say something but stopped himself. He gave a curt nod and turned on his heel, disappearing back through the door. Marianne remained in the council chambers for a moment longer, letting the tension build inside her before following him. The streets outside the palace were filled with people, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. They had once cheered her name in the heat of battle, but now their cheers were cautious whispers. They had fought for freedom, but the bloodied sword at her side was a reminder of the cost. Marianne climbed the steps of the palace, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could feel the pulse of the sword growing stronger, the power within it urging her to take control, to rule with the same force she had used to bring down the king. She raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. The moment stretched, the weight of the people, shared gaze pressing down on her. The sword thrummed at her hip, whispering its sinister promises. You fought for freedom, Marianne began, her voice steady and cold. You fought for the chance to live without the shackles of tyranny. But know this, freedom is fragile. It can be taken away as easily as it is won. The crowd murmured uneasily, and Marianne tightened her grip on the sword. Hilt. The power it offered was intoxicating, filling her with a sense of invincibility. She could feel it feeding off the fear in the crowd, the uncertainty that ripples through them like a wave. There are those who will try to take this victory from us, Tanya, she continued, her voice rising. Those who will seek to undermine what we've fought for. I will not let that happen. I will protect this kingdom with everything I have, even if it means making hard decisions, even if it means shedding more blood. The murmurs grew louder, and Marianne could see the fear in their eyes. But it didn't matter. She had the power, she had the sword, and with it, she could control everything. As she turned to leave, the crowd parted for her, their whispers trailing behind her like ghosts. She could feel their judgment, their unease, but it no longer bothered her. The sword had taken root in her soul, twisting her desires and feeding her ambition. Inside the palace, Caden waited for her at the entrance, his brow furrowed. "Marianne," he began cautiously. "The people are afraid. They want reassurance, not threat. They need to understand what Sans had stayed crying," she replied coldly, brushing past him. "I'm now not gonna let everything we fought for slip away because they grew too weak to handle the truth." Caden didn't tell her this time. His silence was louder than any argument he could have made. Days passed and Marianne's surround grew harsher. Dissent was met with swift retribution, and the sword set's power seeped deeper into her being. The once loyal soldiers who had fought beside her began to question her motives, but none dared confront her openly. Fear had taken hold of the kingdom, and Marianne had become its embodiment. It wasn't high until Lyra returned that the final thread of resistance snapped. Marianne had been sitting in the throne room, the weight of the sword ever present at her side, when the doors swung open and Lyra strode in. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with determination. "You've gone too far," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hand. "This isn't what we fought for, you. That turned into the very thing we sought to destroy." Marianne rose slowly from the throne, her eyes narrowing. "Cyrus, you sound like a traitor, Lyra. I hope you're really not here to challenge me." Lyra's jaw tightened. "I am here to stop you. You've lost sight of who you are, of what we were fighting for." The sword to the sanguis arcanum, and Marianne sighed. "It's twisted you, it's made you into a monster." The room seemed to darken, the air growing thick with tension. Marianne could feel the sword hum in anticipation, feeding off the confrontation. It whispered to her, urging her to strike, to end this rebellion before it could begin. "You don't understand," Marianne said, her voice low and dangerous. "This sword has given me the power to protect the kingdom. Without it, we would be lost." Lyra shook her head. "Number without it, we would be free?" Marianne's hand tightened around the hilt of the sword, and she could feel its dark magic surge through her. But even as the power consumed her, a part of her, a small, desperate part, wanted to stop, wanted to drop the sword and walk away from the abyss that was swallowing her whole. But it was too late. With a sudden burst of speed, Marianne drew the sword, its crimson blade shimmering in the dim light. Lyra moved just as quickly, drawing her own weapon, a simple steel blade that was no match for the power of the sanguis arcanum. The duel was swift and brutal. Marianne saw a sword cut through the air with deadly precision, its magic slicing through flesh and bone. Lyra fought valiantly, but she was no match for the blood magic that surged through Marianne. In the end, it was over in moments. Lyra fell to the ground, blood pooling around her as Marianne stood over her, the sword, sand blade dripping with crimson. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The sword's high whispers grew louder, more insistent, but Marianne couldn't hear them anymore. All she could hear was the sound of Lyra's labored breathing, the final moments of her life slipping away. "You were my friend," Lyra whispered, her voice weak but filled with sorrow. "She could have been a great ruler, but you chose this." Marianne stared down at her, her heart pounding in her chest. The sword's sano power surged, but for the first time it felt hollow, empty. "I had no choice," Marianne whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She had made her choice the moment she had picked up the sword. Lyra's eyes fluttered closed, and Marianne stood there alone once more, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a crushing wave. The sword had given her everything she had wanted: victory, power, control, but it had taken everything else. As the blood from Lyra's body seeped into the ground, the whispers of the sanguis arcanum grew quieter, almost satisfied. But Marianne could feel it. The sword had consumed her body and soul, and there was no turning back. She was the ruler now, but she was no longer the hero of the people. She was something else, something far darker. And in that darkness, she realized she had become the very thing she had fought so hard to destroy.